And then the subtitle of my slide, deliver real intrapreneurial value in your organization. So one of the things we hear a lot is you have to act like an entrepreneur, think like an entrepreneur, and have that innovation mindset when you go into organizations. And I have a lot of empathy for people who are asked to do that, because very often you're in an organization that, for good reason, is actually quite conservative or maybe risk averse, or they have a whole bunch of things that aren't very exciting that they have to deliver on to deliver value to their stakeholders or their shareholders or their employees. And so these two worlds of the startup entrepreneurial world and the enterprise or organizational world, they can coexist. Towards the end of this presentation, I hope to spend about a good 5 minutes on it. I'm going to give you a model that hopefully you can give you a bunch of ways that those two worlds can work together without having the conflict and negative repercussions that often happen. And one quick thing to note is that after this webinar, there will be a PDF of my slides going out there. So you can sit back and relax. You don't have to do screen grabs if there's something that interests you. You'll get all the slides and some additional resources that I'll provide. All right, so let's get into it. So the 5 things we promised for you today are some tools or some frameworks that hopefully you can use the minute that you leave this presentation, and are able to maybe have conversations that are different, or maybe evaluate some of those programs that you might even be working on. So first of all, as I mentioned, avoiding that innovation hype. And then moving beyond idea generation. I think many of us, we hear the word innovation, and what it sounds like is actually those people over there who just keep on generating new ideas, or maybe I'm even being asked to generate new ideas, but nothing ever happens. It actually doesn't make an impact. The change or the innovation doesn't occur. So this is a very deep topic potentially, but I'll give you a couple of insights into that, and maybe a couple of tools that you can investigate after this that might be alternatives that help you get out of that constant idea generation mode. And then building a culture of everyday innovation. So one of the analogies I like to say that we have here in Alberta is we have an everyday culture of safety in many of our organizations. If I think back 20 years ago, that didn't exist. And having worked in very large or energy-focused and health-focused organizations, you can get every single person participating in safety. The same proves true for innovation. Innovation is not something that is relegated to a special group of researchers or a special group of people who have innovation in their titles or in their division. You can actually have every single person in your organization participating. And I've seen it with my own eyes. It can happen, and it's very exciting when employees can have that mind shift and start to participate that way. And then how do those, number 4 is, how do those two worlds of the entrepreneurship, the organization live together in harmony? And then if we have time, I've got my timer running here, so I won't go over. In times of disruption, whether it's macro disruption like our economy or an industry is disrupted, or maybe your project is disrupted where you've had a budget cut, or you have you've lost a personnel, or you've even had a time crunch. Entrepreneurs, designers, they look at those moments as great opportunities for innovation. Within reason, there can be catastrophic change that will force you to shut down a project. But when it's still feasible, you can actually innovate in a way that you've never thought of before, and it can actually be better than ever. So let's look at that innovation hype one first. So I'd like you to imagine this conversation between these two people. And I like to think of sort of 3 different scenarios could be going on. And they're expressing the idea that we need to be more innovative. So this could be a boss talking to her employee and saying, if we're going to make those sales numbers and that, money from revenues coming from new products, we're going to have to be more innovative. Or he could be a consultant talking to a client and saying, you've given some objectives to your team and to me around, say, customer satisfaction or some other objective, and we're going to have to be more innovative to reach that. Or more often than not, these could be 2 employees who are commiserating with each other saying, did you see that memo? I hear down from the top that we have to be more innovative. Well, what does that actually mean? And I'm just going to show you a few pictures here that can, what I'd like to do is show you a few pictures about how different that word innovation can mean, what it can mean to different people, how different it is. So the question I ask you is, so what the heck is innovation? So when I say to you, wow, that was really innovative, especially in your industry, just think about what comes to mind, what picture comes to mind when you think of something that you might read about or hear about, and that was really innovative. If we think about what we see in the media, you see things like this. We see what Elon Musk and SpaceX and rocket ships, or we might think of robots. I think of organizations that get Pepper here, the little robot, and that's a sign that they're being innovative. Or maybe drones, right? We hear about Amazon and what they're doing with drones and other organizations. Or sometimes we think innovation means creativity, lots of different ideas. And I'm going to make that link for you in a moment, that creativity and innovation are linked, but they're not the same thing. Did we think about things like mobile telephony, software? Does it have to be high tech to be innovative? Do you have to have people working together, sitting around a table, maybe at a hackathon or an overnight weekend where they're working on something? Maybe they didn't even know each other before they were brought together. And we see this a lot in our communities and in some organizations where we're going to get together over a particular period of time and try to solve a problem and be innovative. How about Post-it notes? I always make the joke that it seems like Post-it notes are required for innovation, but we've all been there in those idea sessions and workshops, right, where we're furiously writing down our ideas. And is that actually something that you might have thought of for innovation? Maybe there was a pitch. You're presenting to maybe a group of investors, potential clients, or maybe people within your organization that have to agree for you to go forward and do something. And we often think of the pitch. Science might come to mind. Maybe materials, maybe design. Maybe some of us think of a new brand, bringing it forward to the market. So when we think of bringing innovative products to the marketplace, let's remember that it can be a service, a good, a brand, an idea, a different way of behaving, a process improvement. All of those things can actually be innovation. And when we use the word product, it represents all those things. Maybe we looked at better outcomes for patients or better satisfaction for customers and innovating a process or something we do. So there's not a tangible good that comes with it, but it's a better way of doing things. And a lot of business model and process innovation fits into that area. Or something as simple as this, right? Someone had to bring some groceries home or some plants home and said, why don't I just put the handles, why don't I put the handles of the bags over the handles of the bike? But what I'll say to you is, now imagine those two people that were chatting, and what if they were actually working for, say, Safeway? And someone said from on high, we have to be more innovative. Well, what if the gentleman is thinking about, maybe we can be more innovative in grocery delivery by having better bags so that people can take them home on public transit and on their bikes. And the woman is actually saying, I'm into drones. We got to do drone delivery. And the scale of innovation is actually very, very different. I'm going to show you a couple of quick case studies to show you the clash that can happen when people have misalignment around expectations. So there are degrees or intensities of innovation that you might want to work at. Unfortunately, we tend to talk mostly about drones and not so much about what you see here, that practical, everyday innovation that we talk about. So what I'd like to do next is give you a bit of a framework for how you can make sure that you're talking about not only that you have a common language around what innovation is, but that you can also talk about what degree of innovation you're looking for. So these are two different frameworks that I'll present to you briefly here. So we're first going to look at creativity. So creativity, if you went onto Pinterest or onto Google Images, you'd see lots of beautiful quote cards saying all kinds of things about creativity. But this is a great, simple introduction here to what creativity is. So creativity is the generation of novel ideas. So ideas that are distinct from the ideas that have come before. They are differentiated or unique. And very often it's combining existing things in fresh ways. You know, people often say there are no new ideas, just new ways of combining them. Or maybe you're bringing an idea to a new market or a new purpose or a new use, or you're improving it in some way, right? But creativity is trying to get, I always say, the best light bulbs. We want to have great light bulbs that have the potential to one day turn into innovation. All right. So invention is the next step. One of those ideas seems to have merit, and it's that idea of applying perhaps some money, some time, and some talent to see if you can move that idea forward into a prototype phase or a pilot project, perhaps, or in this case, a patent that I think I'm probably good at saying it didn't go into the marketplace because it's a tricycle that's also a lawnmower. So someone invented the idea of, I can have 4-year-olds driving around lawns and cutting them while getting their exercise. So that tends to stay in the invention mode, and we think of tinkerers who never actually bring it to the marketplace. But creativity and invention are essential elements of ultimately getting to innovation. So let's just read that definition together before we walk through this one. Innovation is creating value, and that's value for both parties, the recipient of the innovation and the developer of it, by bringing a desired new product, remember the goods and services and brands, etc., to a marketplace or community. And that marketplace of communities I've written here can be internal or external, so you can innovate within your organization. So if we just look at the model, one of those ideas seemed great. We put it into that prototype stage for, in the case of the iPhone, the idea of bringing a computer and a phone together. Other people had already tried this, right? So they weren't the first to invent it. But they came up with a patent, they did some prototypes, they did some tests, and they said, you know, I think this might have some merit. So why don't we actually apply a bit more money and a bit more time and bring it out into the marketplace? And you see everyone with their iPhones in their hand now in this image. So that's where it has reached acceptance and gone out into the market. And then value is created. And on the right-hand side, you see a dollar sign again and a clock. That's because sometimes the value that the person is getting is perhaps saving money or saving time, but could also be things like improved health. It could be happiness. It could be a status symbol. It could be fun. It depends. The value exchange is not always monetary. In the case of when we use things like Facebook, it's our donation of our time to be able to use the service. So you haven't reached innovation if you haven't actually brought it out into the world, had it accepted in one way or another, and the world could be your own organization, and then created that value. So again, what tends to happen when we talk about it is we pretend it's all about iPhones. We don't talk about the fact that it is sometimes more simple things, and we often get stuck in the idea generation mode. We get stuck down there in creativity. And you see a group that maybe, gee, they don't seem to be delivering much. And you want to be able to get up into that space. And so when you talk like you're working, doing things like Apple is doing, but you're actually stuck in the bottom, that's where we can call this innovation hype. And so there's a great resource. This is, I'm taking this here from a company called CB Insights that came up with the term innovation theater. And they call it corporate innovation theater, 8 simple ways to look more innovative. But I can tell you, it's also startup innovation theater, or mid-sized company innovation theater, or service provider. Because I've seen this happen time and time again, where people talk about it, but they're not delivering. And so they have a real humorous approach. They've created this infographic that looks at signs that you might be stuck in creativity and not making it to innovation. So I'm just going to give you 4 of the 8, and you're welcome to look at the other 4 on your own time. So the examples they give are people around you starting to change their titles? So your data manager is now a digital prophet and is wearing a cool t-shirt, at work. Or maybe number 4 out of 8, you're adopting the jargon. Instead of talking about doing pilots and tests, are you starting to hear people say we're failing fast and we're disrupting? But you actually just, didn't we always do that? Wasn't it called a pilot test or a prototype? Or number 5, my favorite, do the pilgrimage. Let's all go down to Silicon Valley because there must be something magic there and it can rub off on me. And Silicon Valley, one of my favorite expressions I heard from someone is that Canada's Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, because that is a 100-year unique experiment and evolution that has happened down there that no one has ever been able to recreate anywhere else. And lots of mythology there. One quick one I'll give you is that the age of the average founder of a successful tech company in Silicon Valley is not a young college student. They are a 40-year-old person who has worked for 6 to 10 years already in a corporation and has come up with an idea for something they want to do. And less than a quarter ever receive venture capital. So mythology there is also great. And then the last one that we'll touch upon a bit more deeply here is that idea of acceleration. Let's build an innovation lab. Let's build an accelerator. And the way we'll measure if it's successful, if lots of people come to events and lots of people go through them, but we actually don't have metrics for how are we helping our company be more successful? How are we directly impacting our innovation ambition? How are we making the lives of our customers better? How are we generating new revenue? There seems to be a disconnect there. And so what tends to happen is we tend to build things like these incubation labs and innovation labs. And I'll come into our places, and it doesn't matter where I go in the world, and they tend to look like these. Lots of glass walls, lots of open spaces, lots of whiteboards, lots of excitement. And on the left-hand side, the things you see there like unicorns and rocket ships, words like hackathon and angel and capital and, apps and geeks. These words tend to get used a lot. But you can imagine having a very conservative corporate organization and, dropping in something like this where people are often isolated and off working on, this cool kid stuff. And that's where you create the tension and the clash. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of two organizations, Target and General Electric, that both tried to do this in different ways, and both were wildly unsuccessful because they weren't recognizing that their culture was conservative, and we have to find a culturally appropriate way to take advantage of this startup energy and these innovative experiments and ways of doing things while respecting who we are as a brand and as a culture. In the bottom right-hand corner, the picture you see is something that Target did in San Francisco, and it looks a lot like an Apple store, and they called it Open House, and it was their idea of trying to be more, I call it being innovative instead of being innovative, where people could come in and look at products and interface with them and talk with each other, but as you'll see in a moment, it didn't go so well. So just a couple of case studies about what can happen when we don't respect these two different cultures. So these are some news headlines that I've clipped, and if we go over to the left-hand side where you've got two news headline clippings and it says 2015, this is where Target said, we're going to turn Minneapolis into a Silicon Valley, and they partnered with Techstars, a Silicon Valley accelerator, to try to build this retail accelerator, and they also built spaces in California that were isolated from the parent corporation, were experimenting on out-of-the-box thinking. So by 2016, they were doing things like building the store of the future and using robots to do different things that people did, and really out there experimentation. You can find some videos online that look at this. But as you go to the far right, by 2017, Target stunned everyone. Within 2 years, they shut everything down. And there's a great video of the CEO saying, we can't just experiment for experimentation's sake. Our innovation has to drive core value. We have to be able to satisfy our stockholders and shareholders and stakeholders, and we have to be able to deliver value to our customers, all the while being innovative but not trying to change who we are as an organization. And as we know, a lot of the big box stores are struggling. So he shut it down, and the chief information officer and strategist lost their job. And even more recently, these are both within this year, this fall, the CEO of GE was asked to retire, as were some of his senior team, and it was actually shareholder pressure that said, you have to keep delivering value on our investment in your organization. And what they had tried to do at GE was holistically change the entire DNA of the organization by combining their classic Six Sigma, quality, operational excellence style of being with this lean startup, lean, and they even had Eric Rice come in and train all their employees on how to fail fast and do agile development. Now, I spoke with some employees at GE in their Shanghai R&D center. They were very excited, and interesting things were happening, but they had shareholder pressure because they weren't able to successfully deliver as a corporation and at the same time embrace this way of being innovative. All right. So switching gears to the second topic then is, let's give you a couple of techniques about moving beyond idea generation. Now, we all love to generate ideas, and we know that creative ideas, great light bulbs, are essential to eventually move into great innovation. But how do we know we're generating the best light bulbs, right? The best ideas. So one of the things to think about is this idea of brainstorming. And I just have a fear that this little thing, I'm just moving a little square on my screen. And when I ask people, why do we brainstorm? We've all been taught how to brainstorm. We all know the rules of brainstorming, right? Lots of ideas, no bad ideas, get them down quickly. And there's been some really great writing lately in Harvard Business Review and in the New Yorker, bringing into the popular press some research that's been done over the years about, well, who came up with brainstorming and does it actually work? So the founder, the grandfather here of brainstorming is Alex Osborne. So he's often referred to as one of the original madmen. So he was a Madison Avenue advertising innovator, one of the first, if not the first, and the co-founder of the agency BBDO that we still see, remnants of today with various amalgamations of different organizations. So he's the O of BBDO, and you see he was born back in the 1800s and lived into the 60s. And he loved to talk to his team about how can we come up with more innovative campaigns, headlines, product names, and let's actually think about the brain as sort of a creative muscle and how can we make it work better. So starting in the 1940s, he began to, I'm just going to click on this guy here. He began to write books like the classic, The Gold Mine Between Your Ears. I know I'd never read that. Or How to Think Up, or Your Creative Power. These were all popular books at the time that he wrote for his team and for others. Some of them were bestsellers for how to start to think differently and have a bit of a systemic approach so that you could use a system to think in a way that you wouldn't naturally think. And as we can see right in the middle there, and they're having soup instead of coffee, but that's a team back in the 1950s at his advertising agency, brainstorming. And it was his orange and black book that you see here, Applied Imagination, where he first came up with that term. And as you see, the rules back then, criticizing is ruled out, the wilder ideas, the better, lots of quantity, and the last one is that you can build upon others' ideas. You can add things together or build upon them. So we all know this, right? And it actually comes from this advertising firm. But the challenge is group brainstorming is a waste of time. And I know when I learned about this, I was also shocked. This is a headline, as I mentioned, from HBR, but there are other articles about it and lots of primary research. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, if you're trying to come up with the best light bulbs and innovate, you can't just do group brainstorming. It's not enough because a bunch of things are missing. The two main things that are missing are you don't have the time to incubate the ideas. So our brains like to find patterns and associations between things, right? Those novel ideas. And we often do it when we're in the shower, when we're driving home. The number of people have told me they come up with their great ideas after they're sleeping or while they're sleeping. We need to have this dissociated personal time to be able to reflect and to incubate ideas. The other thing that's missing is constructive debate. Contrary to some of those early rules of all the ideas are good and generate as many as you can, which is great, you then need to move into a space of not only incubation but just discussion and debate, and have techniques that help you kind of poke holes in the ideas or go through thought experiments about why it might work or not work. And those two things are missing. And so what has come out of this is actually a system called the OSBORN-Parnes system. Osborne's initial idea was built upon by some professors who looked at other steps that you could include before brainstorming and after brainstorming to actually work you through all the way to getting that idea to implementation. So kind of a warm-up, doing that brainstorming, then having more of a debate, discussion, new information, improving on those ideas, and then together thinking about implementation and reflecting when you're going out and testing this idea, is it working well, and do we need to kind of come back and start again or rethink some things, so that it's more of that flow. Now, an example I'm going to give you here, many of you would have heard of design thinking, which is similar, but the Osborne-Parnes method is actually called creative problem solving. And so picture of Alex Osborne and actually Dr. Sidney Parnes, one of the professors, and this is done at Buffalo State University. You can do a master's degree and study creative processes there. And often not mentioned, but Dr. Ruth Knoller, she was also one of the researchers that looked at and worked with Osborne back in the early days, and they said, how can we make this into a more robust system? So you see that there are actually 6 steps broken into 3 categories that are more of a creative workflow. And you'll notice that it's just the very first step in the idea finding category that is generating those ideas, which is the brainstorming part. So, and lots of great videos on this. It's open sourced, so lots of information. And if you want to look at this process and use it, you're welcome to. And it's something in our workshops with U of A we also use. I'm just going to touch on a couple of other methods. Design thinking that many of you will have seen and probably tried and maybe have a workshop. It's not exactly like creative problem solving, but you can see that there are definitely similar steps, right? Of generating some discovery, some ideas, going into that ideation phase, looking at different experiments and opportunities, and then seeing if we need to evolve the idea. Where design thinking isn't quite as strong is in the implementation. I find personally creative problem solving stronger. And then cramped is just, I'll quickly touch on it. That's a method that we use in our practice and we use in our workshops, where these are thought experiments where each of the letters in the word cramped or a thought experiment that you can run to come up with those better and more creative ideas. And then I've left systematic creativity, because systematic creativity, all of these different processes, and there are about 25 different processes that are similar to creative problem solving, they all kind of find their roots back in Lego's systematic creativity. So that's sort of the grandfather of, or grandmother of that process. All right. So let's move into one of our other takeaways, building that culture of everyday innovation. So how can we actually do like we do in safety and build that culture of everyday change? So I'd like to use an analogy of cars. So this will hopefully be a vocabulary where you get to talk, with your colleagues, with your boss, or with your client, to say, is it handlebars on bikes? Is it, bag handles on bikes, or are we talking drones? Right, so when we think of the car, just using an analogy here, a car that you've already bought that's not having any change happening to it is kind of the status quo, no innovation. Whereas a car that is that next year's improvement is what's called core innovation. It's that operational excellence, continual improvement, things we're doing like that. And we're used to seeing that type of incremental change happening. Adjacent is when your organization is trying to add either a new product or new service and offering to what you're doing, or perhaps reaching a new market. And this could be the case where Ford decides they want to, say, add electric cars to their mix. Electric cars aren't new to the world, but they're new to Ford. And these are the two spaces, core and adjacent, that most of us will work in. Whereas once again, we tend to talk at the transformational space, that disruptive innovation that creates both whole new markets and products that have never been seen. So we think of Daimler Chrysler, right, and their development of an online system to be able to do car sharing. Again, people were experimenting this before. They were at that invention and prototyping stage, but Car2Go being one of the marketplaces that was one of the products that was able to create a whole new market and bring a whole new product. So what's surprising about this is when we look at where do companies spend their investment money and time. I said it's mostly in core and adjacent, even though we talk transformational. And I'd just like to give you quickly a couple of examples. So when we look at PepsiCo, about 98% of their time is focused on adjacent or core. And you'll see that they're focused 80% of their time on existing markets and existing products. So PepsiCo being an example of a leading consumer goods company. I've used GE as an example, and we talked about what they did before, that about 70% of their time would be spent on existing products and existing markets. A little bit more of their time focused on actually investing in trying to achieve transformational. And what's interesting is often your adjacent ideas or your core ideas turn into transformational because something happens that you didn't expect in the marketplace. And even a mid-sized technology firm, and here I'm just using Shopify, and by the way, this model comes, you can read about it in Harvard Business Review, and it comes from Deloitte, and they've actually built upon some early marketing grids that those of you who are marketers would recognize, this product market grid that's kind of been adapted. But even a company like a Shopify, which is a mid-sized technology firm, a couple of thousand people, again, a bit more transformation, a bit more adjacent, but a full 85% of their time is focused on serving their current markets or just adding new products or markets that already exist to their offering. You can think of them expanding. And the challenge is when we don't talk like this and we don't realize that we can hire people that come in and expect to be doing, SpaceX, they expect to be doing drones. And we have them instead doing quality assurance or operational excellence. And they feel like they're not part of the cool kids group. Whereas what we really see is most of the innovation happening in an organization is actually at this more calm or maintaining type of innovation that we often hear talked about. Okay, so that might give you an opportunity to really have a conversation and say, what are we trying to achieve? Is it handlebars or drones? And let's have that conversation. So then how do you do it? Let's look at this framework here. We've got about 5 minutes left to look at this framework about, well, then how do you work together to drive entrepreneurial impact in your organization? How do these two worlds of transformation, because a small startup would be living up in that transformational world, right? Trying to create new to the world products and new to the world markets. So how can they live together? So intrapreneurship is trying to adapt those entrepreneurial attitudes and strategies inside a bureaucratic organization. Bureaucracy, not necessarily a bad thing, right? It helps you scale and streamline things. And implementing those practices with a large organization to produce valued innovation. And I'm just going to skip over the next cartoon in the sake of time here to get to this framework. So this is a framework I've been working on for a couple of years, and it gives you a whole list of things you can do so that the target situation and the GE situation don't happen. Or you as an employee may be working in one of those innovation labs. In 2 years, you don't get marginalized or they don't shut down the lab. So this is ways to actually have that entrepreneurial thing happen. So the first is make sure you're recognizing that operational excellence and continuous improvement is innovation. Recognize people when they're doing it and call it out as innovation, just like we do with safety. The second is find pockets of small innovative things that are already happening in your organizations and see if you can scale them. This is a process called bright spots, where we look within our company or even a peer company or even another industry and say, has someone already solved this problem? And can we just bring it in and scale it throughout the organization? So those are both high impact, low risk ways of looking at bringing innovation into your organization. When we're moving up and we're trying to bring new products in or bring new markets into our organization, starting with number 3 and going up, we kind of have 4 different approaches here. We can act as an organization as an anchor customer to an innovative supplier. Give them a 3-year contract so that they can innovate and we can learn from them. And it won't risk our bottom line, right? Because this is a project that we're working on. Or do a simple RFP. Sometimes a 2-page RFP. If we're looking for innovation and we're looking to work with a small company, simplified it. And the BC government has done this. Under a certain value, when they're looking for innovation, they only have a 2-page RFP because small companies can't meet all of the criteria for typical RFPs, and so you're shutting them out of the process. And again, run that as an experiment. You can run innovation projects and competitions, not idea contests, but contests to actually solve a specific problem and give them some constraints. There's a couple of methods that are here that we could go into in more detail later, but running those competitions that are actually solving very practical problems you're trying to solve. Very often your employees may have solved that problem already in another organization or know someone who has. And then forming alliances or partnerships, right? Maybe that supplier now can turn into a partner, or you can work with a complementary organization or partner up with a peer in another country, especially if you're in a regulated organization and you can only operate as in Alberta or in your country. Work with another organization who's trying to solve the same things and have a formal alliance with them. Number 6 is acquire innovators. Now this is often where people start. Let's just buy a startup. But if you do buy a startup, maybe treat them as a little separate organization or maybe hire someone from them and let them run independently for a while. Because it's been said, you know, corporations or organizations see these types of innovators kind of as viruses to stop, right? Because we have to deliver on that shareholder value. And then when we're up in the transformational space, the last one we'll touch on just as we end here are maybe you have to, if you come up with an idea, you're working with a startup, it seems to be working well, but your culture is still very conservative. Run it as a spin-off. Start a little new venture, a new corporation. And I always think about Disney versus Pixar, right? Disneyland versus Pixar movies, right? Or these can actually be quite different and different cultures that are needed to run both of those organizations, even though they have the same parent. And last but not least, minority new ventures. If an employee group or a single employee decides, I want to go out and do a startup, how can you have a weak tie to them? Could you go back to number 3 and invest in them or sign them up as a supplier so that you can benefit from the experiments they're doing outside? So those are 8 different approaches that you can have that are not buying a startup and then just pretending that they're going to live directly within you or trying to change the whole DNA of your organization to act like a small person startup, which tends to not go very well. Now, just in the sake of time, the only thing I wanted to say to you was, I know we're going through a time of disruption in Alberta with our economy, but in 2008 and 2009, all of these products started. Yeah, when you have disruption, it's often the best time to look at how can I do things differently. And not only did all these projects start then, but Shopify, Hootsuite, and Slack were all side projects of companies that did not think that these were going to be the billion-dollar companies that they are today. And they all began in 2008 and 2009 as small internal projects to help how the companies worked. So software platforms that they developed just for internal use, that eventually the experiments turned into transformational innovation with all of them. All right, so I'll just leave you with that thought. And I try to imagine in Alberta if there are any of these side projects that are starting. And so to end, these are a series of just 5 questions that summarize what we've talked about today. And when you are asked to be more innovative, think about these 5. So how do you and I define innovation, whether it's your colleague or your executive suite? What degree of innovation do we aspire to? Are we looking at core, or we want drones? Do we want transformational? And then how can we ensure that we're not just talking about doing innovation in that theater, but we're actually changing the culture of how we do things and everybody is included? Do we make sure that we respect the culture of our organization and not try to become something we're not? And can we reframe and embrace challenges like budgets that are reduced, or the number of staff that we have that are reduced? And can those actually be catalysts for better innovation, like the Hootsuites and Shopifys of the world? So I'll end here and see if Namita has any questions. And I know we're up against our next presenter that's going to talk to you a bit about the Job Grants program. But you can also email me if you need it. And Jamal, as I said, when he reaches out to you again, will be providing a copy of this PowerPoint. And I have a whole bunch of resources on the back end. So thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Sharon. Lots of resources. And so a couple of questions that we've got over here. So the first one is, what's the best way to get the guy with the gray hair to be more open to innovation and change?
Right. So the guy with the gray hair or the woman with the gray hair is often that person you come up against where you say, I've got a great idea, and you can just see the brakes coming on. And the best way is to actually run a small experiment that shows that it's successful. Do something small that shows that it's actually lower risk. We have clients who want this, or employees are willing to change, because it's the job of the gray-haired person like me to deliver on shareholder and stakeholder value. So instead of looking at them as a barrier, look at them as a constraint. I have to prove to them that this could be successful. And once you've got a couple of small successful experiments under your belt, that person will come along because they too know that they have to differentiate in the marketplace to continue to deliver value. So prove it. Don't just say it. Actually show them through some small experiments that it works.
Okay.
And ask for their advice. It's always a good thing to ask for their advice, because they're a wealth of knowledge usually too.
Our next question is, do you have any recommendations on providing scope or criteria for innovation? It's often seen innovation is championed as an open book, but in past experience, I haven't seen it to be more effective when a focus area or goal is provided to the organization.
Yes. So whoever asked that one, I'm 100% aligned with you. Here's a great, one of my mantras, it's actually my favorite saying, is creativity loves constraints, and so does innovation. So focusing, constraints, designing a sandbox, and there are lots of quotes. I know at the conference that we did with you, Namita, we talked about people like Jeff Bezos, etc., that they work with constraints. An area of focus, not blue sky thinking, not broad, wide open thinking, but actually saying you can only have this much money, this much time, this many resources, and really focus it on an area of your organization. Because often, too, you want people to start to get used to this culture of innovation. They only know how to brainstorm. So start them with small projects, start them with very specific focus and constraints. One of my favorite groups that does this very well is actually the Gates Foundation. There's a thing I call the Gates constraints. Whenever they go out and look to solve really big problems, they have a simple set of very clear constrained criteria so that the solutions that come in are very practical and can get developed. Now that said, there is a space for blue sky thinking, absolutely. There is a space for pure research, but not when you are delivering on the bottom line, right? There can be a certain amount of money, a certain amount of time that can be allocated to that, but there has to be awareness that those experiments might fail and fail, significantly. I like the day-to-day innovation, even in the adjacent space, to always have very specific focused areas of the business in constraint. So it's the opposite of often what we're taught.
Okay, perfect. And also keeping in mind the limited time we have, I'm just going to combine a couple of these. What books could you recommend on everyday innovation, and are there any resources that you could share with us?
Right. So I will just show you an example of some of the books that I'm recommending to you. So Frugal Innovation is awesome. It's one of the ones I like the best. Free Prize Inside. And my favorite book by Seth Godin is How to Have a Great Idea and Not Get the Gray Hairs Mad at You. How do you get those ideas through? And then a couple of other books here, especially Switch and Thinker Toys. Switch, if you had to read one book, that's the one I would look at, where they teach you how to do bright spots. How can I find what's already hidden and working in my organization or in another? And how can I find that and then scale it? So if it's already working, it's very low risk. It's just that it's hidden. And we do this with clients all the time, and we can generate millions of dollars of savings and new revenue by just finding hacks or MacGyvers or ways people are doing things, highlighting them, and then getting people to share them. So I've got a whole bunch of books like this that I can share with you.
Okay, perfect. Well, Sharon, thank you so much. That was super information. Thanks again for your time, and thank you everyone for attending.